All right, we're back again with another foundational document video. Today we are going to be focusing on Federalist 70, or Hamilton's defense of a singular, a strong executive branch. So document snapshot, first and foremost. This is Hamilton discussing the presidency, discussing the executive branch. A lot of anti-federalists have been complaining about the strength of the executive. If you look at the British government and you look at the proposed constitution, the closest thing we have to a monarch, to an American king, is the executive branch. It's a single individual who has a lot of power, and understandably, to the anti-federalists, they were fearful of that. Okay, so Hamilton defends that idea of a single strong executive by making the following points, just in general. The executive needs to be strong. Uh, the Spider-Man quote, "With great power comes great responsibility." Well, that also works in reverse. We're giving the executive a lot of responsibility, and in order for them to execute their job, they need a lot of power. They need the ability to make decisive action. And they also need to be insulated from the legislative branch. A combination of branches in the founder's mind is the most dangerous thing for the type of government that they've established. And a strong executive will be able to stay independent of what many thought would be the strongest branch of government, or the one most apt to tyranny, which is the legislative branch. The second point is that the executive needs to be a single person as opposed to a plurality or a group or two people, simply because they have to have that negotiating ability with foreign powers. They have to be able to make decisive or take decisive action, especially in cases of foreign or domestic rebellion or invasion. And lastly, if it's a single person holding this office, then the people will be able to hold that executive accountable if they are doing things that are in the interests of themselves and not of the nation. Okay, so this is commonly referred to throughout the passage by Hamilton in very wordy prose as energy in the executive. Okay, he believes that a strong executive is necessary for a strong government or a well-run government. Okay, on the flip side, if you have a weak executive or a weak execution of the laws, then you have a bad government, in Hamilton's argument. Okay, a strong executive gives you a lot of things. It gives you protection of the community against foreign attacks. It gives you a steady administration of the laws. It gives you protection of property, especially when there's movements away from justice. Okay, and security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, faction, and of anarchy. So factions is showing up again in this argument in Federalist 70. Okay. So what is this energy? What is this power that's being described by the executive? Hamilton kind of breaks it down into four pieces, but Fed 70 only deals with the first piece. Okay. The ingredients which constitute energy in the executive are unity. That's what we're going to spend the rest of this video on, and what Hamilton spends the rest of Federalist 70 on. Duration, adequate provisions for its support, and lastly, competent powers. Okay. But like I said, he focuses on unity throughout this essay. So, unity. Hamilton offers two dangerous paths forward in regard to unity of the executive, or actually in regard to disunity of the executive. The first is two co-equal executives, each with the same degree of power, designed to kind of counteract the worst ambitions of the other if necessary. It was a proposed plan by the anti-federalists, kind of having these two co-executives. The other plan would then be a council of officials and experts serving as the executive. Now, Hamilton's kind of vague. Is this a council of 6 to 12 that are making decisions as a group of 6 to 12? Or is this a single executive who has a group of advisors? Now, you will note, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that we do have something very similar to B. We have a single executive, and then that executive is advised by the cabinet. Okay, but we'll talk about kind of the tweak that the framers put in place to protect from some of the things that Hamilton warns us about in this essay. The dangers of plurality. This is going to be a long slide. There's a lot of info here, but basically this is what Hamilton's discussing the whole time. Throughout his entire paper, this is what he's discussing. First and foremost, having two executives is dangerous because it could lead to disagreement. And disagreement could cause people to not respect the president, not only within our country, but foreign leaders from respecting the office. It could weaken the authority, make them less important as far as their words or their actions, because there's somebody else who could say something different. And lastly, serve as a distraction. If you're competing with another person who has the same power as you to affect a certain policy, you're less concerned about affecting the best policy and more concerned with winning. Okay, and that's not necessarily something we want out of the president. The executives asked to be decisive, and two people who could disagree or debate and aren't really able to compromise if they view things from diametrically opposed positions, they're not going to be decisive. Tempers can lead to the rise of faction. So again, that idea of faction shows up here as well. Okay, two executives could both act in a way that's detrimental to the nation, but then blame the other person and therefore not be held accountable by the people. There's no form of punishment, and by punishment we mean getting elected or gaining support. There's no punishment if they kind of point fingers at each other and neither one is held accountable. Hamilton uses this term conceal faults and destroy responsibility. That's something that two co-presidents would lead to. And lastly, he uses an example from state constitutions and from state governments, and he mentions that he's too classy to go into any specifics and actually give you names. But he uses examples in which both executives could basically condemn an action that they agreed to take, blame it on the other person, and then the people would be left with no method of accountability to that elected official. And also, it would erode that relationship between government and citizen. Okay, so that's another danger of having co-presidents or having some council that's in charge of executing the laws. Okay. Now, he does go off on a little tangent in regards to the legislative branch while defending the executive branch. And this is about the executive branch's need for decisive action, the idea that the president needs to be able to make a decision and that the government has to kind of move forward with that decision, particularly after a law's been passed by Congress. And now it comes to the execution of that law or the enactment of that law. There's not a lot of time for debate. It needs to be relatively decisive, okay? And he compares that decisiveness with the legislative branch's need for compromise and debate, and for lack of a better word, conservatism, that Congress should move slowly, that Congress should be contemplative when it comes to what course of action is best. And that's a good thing. And what that leads to is laws that are hopefully, knock on wood, for the betterment of the entire nation, not just some majority faction. Okay. On the flip side, when it comes to the executive branch, you don't want that debate. You don't want compromise. You want a single person who's able to effectively execute the laws and move forward with a direct course of action. You don't want a lot of compromise or gray area. Okay. The cabinet, he does close out this quote, which it sounds a lot like our cabinet that's laid out in the Constitution briefly. It says, a counsel to a magistrate who is himself responsible for what he does are generally nothing better than a clog upon his good intentions, are often the instruments and accomplices of his bad, and are almost always a cloak to his faults. Basically meaning that a cabinet of advisors, a council, will stop a president or an executive from doing the right thing, will often enable or encourage him to do the wrong thing because they're not going to suffer any consequences, and can potentially be a place where the executive can point and say, it was my advisor, it wasn't me, and allow the people, muddy the waters and not allow the people to hold the president accountable. Okay, that's this idea of this cabinet. Okay, of this council to a magistrate or to an executive. How did the framers attempt to limit the negative influences of a council on the executive? What was a check and a balance that they put into the Constitution in regard to the president's advisors? You can pause the video if you want, but I'm going to kind of get right into the answer for time purposes. The Constitution offers senatorial consent. Presidential appointees to the cabinet have to go before the Senate and have to be approved. So this gives the legislative branch an opportunity to prevent the president from filling his cabinet full of people that might not necessarily be fit for the job, might not be good advisors, might have ulterior motives. Okay. Now, we do know from studying Unit 2 and the president and the Senate and how they relate to one another, if they're of the same political party, you're less likely to get this congressional check, although it could still happen. And furthermore, you also have to take into account that the Senate, regardless of political party, usually defers to the president and allows him or her to pick his or her own team. So although this check is there and the founders were counting on it to prevent this council from being a corrupting influence, largely the Senate kind of defers to the president on this. Okay. But constitutionally, it's there. Now, real quick, Hamilton does not go into this defense at all. He just throws this quote out there and then pretty much ends the essay. Okay. Or shortly thereafter. This is a check and balance that you can bring in from the Constitution in regards to how you control for this. But there's no defense of this cabinet idea within Federalist 70. Okay. My best guess for how this would be used, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can go. The executive's or president's powers, maybe something about the rise of the imperial presidency or something like that, and how we've given the president immense power in order to execute the law, in order to execute world wars and things like that. Presidential approval ratings, the importance of presidential approval ratings in the president's ability to get things done. If you have a president with a high approval rating, particularly during a honeymoon phase, those first 100 days, they're able to affect a lot of change. And if you have a president without a high approval rating, or particularly during a lame duck period, they're not able to affect a lot of change. Need for a single executive. I mean, that's kind of basic within the document. That's carbon copy of Hamilton's argument. President's cabinet could pop up. Checks and balances between Congress and the executive. Again, there's nothing laid out directly as far as checks and balances, but you can infer or connect this with the Constitution to get there. The Electoral College. Need for debate and conservatism by Congress and decisive action by the president, so one or the other. And lastly, the one that probably terrifies you the most in reading this list, but I think is a potential use, is a critique of the federal bureaucracy as being neither united in personage, it's not a single person making decisive action, or, able to move quickly, okay? When we studied the bureaucracy, we talked about red tape, and we talked about how it's this institutionalized set of policies that often don't change regardless of who the president is. That could be seen by the framers if they, fast forward in history and now look at what the bureaucracy is doing, what the executive branch has become. It's kind of this unwieldy part of the government, something that's not responsive to the people, not responsive to the executive, kind of has a will of its own, okay? Which are things that Hamilton was not accounting for in Federalist 70. Okay, so if you can spend some time kind of connecting the arguments that he makes about what an executive should be versus what the bureaucracy, because it is part of the executive branch, has become, that might serve you in kind of studying in that area for the argumentative essay. Can you think of any more potential uses of the document? Best of luck in preparing, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.